I guess I want to say here, just to start off with, that when you, particularly the subject of reunification, is probably one of the best research subjects in child welfare. And, this is a very spotty record. If you looked at many kind of subjects in child welfare, really important ones, there, in some instances, there just isn't a lot of research about it. And it's a few studies, if there are any at all. And it's mostly practice wisdom. But when you get to reunification, that's quite different. Even 5 or 6 years ago, when I was at Casey, I looked at the I had time to do a pretty comprehensive review of studies on this subject. And at that point, this was several years ago, there were 700 published studies in 30 years. 700. And there probably had only been maybe 6, 8, not even in the double digits. Not that many experimental studies, in the sense that one intervention was pitted against another one in some kind of experimental design. There weren't that many of those, but there was an enormous number of studies. And that has really continued really in the last 5 years, because there are now these huge administrative databases that the feds have, Chapin Hall has, the states have. And so there's just an enormous amount of administrative data on this particular subject and related ones in the permanent planning area here. And so now I guess I want to say here that despite all this research, no amount of research can ever solve or resolve all these social value questions that I'm sure some of you have, and maybe we can talk about later. So information is one thing. Interpretation of information, that's something else. But social values that shape policy, and that shape policy goals and legislation, and that guide our everyday decisions about what we think is best for kids, that's something that, of course, it's related information, but it's not the same thing. And so it's very important, and I think invaluable, when you have discussions, to kind of try, insofar as it's possible, to keep these two sort of spheres separate. That is, there's research, there's factual information, there's theory, there's lots of administrative data. That's one thing. And then there's legislation, there's social policy, there's social values. That's a separate thing. And of course, obviously, the two have some kind of connection. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking here, right? But they're still separate things. And so people can really, it's much easier to have discussions about subjects when you share some factual information. And that's why I'm going to start off with that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the factual information can resolve all of the value differences. That just is probably a naive idea there, right? But somehow it's become common in the United States, and not just in child welfare, but in every area, where somehow, instead of information guiding value discussions, it's the other way around. People start off with their values, and then they decide whether they want to even believe that there's factual information about a subject that's not consistent with whatever their values are. So that's a bad way of having a discussion. And that's why I'm going to start off with this thing about some of the factual information. So I guess for first thing, we're going to talk mostly, you guys are CASAs, we're going to talk mostly about reunification that comes out of legal structure. But I think it's, where there are dependency findings on kids, and there have kids most of the time have been removed from parents for some type of maltreatment. That's not always true, but it's usually the case. But there's lots of reunifications that happen outside of legal structure, and that probably as CASAs you would never be aware of. So there are, it used to be that it was even more true. When I was with the agency, and maybe 1/5 of all placements resolved in a week. A lot of those brief placements have gone by the by, and we're going to talk about that. So that's not quite as extreme as it used to be. But just as a guess here, based on information that I received from Partners for Our Children just a few years ago, I probably maybe 1/4 to 1/3 of all kids who go into care go home within a couple of months, and a lot of times without any dependency finding or dependency structure at all, right? But the cases that we're going to talk about, the kids that have legal structure, of course, that in addition to maltreatment, the parents typically have drug alcohol issues, or they have frequently co-occurring mental health disorders. Domestic violence is quite common. Those are kind of and of course the families are poor. Um, there was a study done in this state by Partners for Our Children in 2009. That was a survey of 700 or 800 families with open child welfare cases in Washington State. And at that point, about half of all the families with open cases had incomes of $10,000 or less. And 60, almost 3 in 5 of parents with kids in foster care had incomes of $10,000 or less. So that's just not, of course, poor, that's severely poor. That's poor with episodic homelessness. That's poor with food insecurity and with lots of material hardship there. And a lot of times, as you know, that's a kind of a degraded kind of a poverty. It's not just being poor. There are other aspects to it. But of course, it starts off with material hardship. And material hardship concretely means physical pain. It means a lot of emotional pain as well, but it means physical pain. So that's what we're talking about with, and that's, remember, in 2009, 2010, that was almost 60% of parents with kids in Washington State's child welfare system. Now, for some reason that I don't fathom or have never been explained to me, those numbers, our numbers, are more extreme than the numbers in some other states. So, every child welfare system deals mostly with low-income people, but not necessarily with as high a percentage of severely poor low-income people as we do in this state. And that would be an interesting subject for a study as to why that's so, but it's very much the case here. And of course, it shapes very much what has to happen or what ought to be happening in reunification, because of course we're dealing with very poor people who are very troubled and who have all kinds of manner of impairments, and frequently several of them. And of course, and I haven't even mentioned some that, you may have cases where parents have cognitive impairments, they have IQs of 80 or below, there may be someone in the family that's been to prison or maybe is in prison. So that's the group of people we're talking about here, right? So there has been, and of course, or maybe you don't, there was the federal government in the mid to late 1990s passed the Adoption and Safe Family Act, which changed timelines for reunification to 15 out of 22 months. And in a lot of states have even drafted timelines that are more severe than that. And in an attempt to keep kids from, particularly very young kids, from growing up in foster care. So, and there's a whole bunch of research around the extent to which states have complied or not complied with those laws. And suffice to say that in this state, several years ago, probably less than half of the cases with legally dependent kids really were within those timelines. So there was a lot of fudging, there was a lot of continuances, judges looking the other way or allowing cases to go on longer. And maybe, and I don't know what extent that continues to be the case, but it was the case a few years ago, right? So there has been, since in the last 20 years, a major change in the profile of completed permanent plans in this country. I don't mean just in Washington. So probably in 2000, as a guess, there might have been 20 to 25,000 adoptions a year in this country. Last year there were 65,000 adoptions out of child welfare. So, I mean, you're talking about at least a 250% increase in adoptions in the space of 20 years, whereas the percentage of kids who have been reunified has now, in the last 2 or 3 years, has dropped below 50%. And so in the last couple of years, it was maybe 47, 48% of kids were reunified. And for years, it was about half, or just a little bit more than half. And now in recent years, that's gone down a bit. So anyone, I frequently hear claims from some groups of people that child welfare policy kind of favors parents' rights over children's rights, or is tilted in the wrong direction or something like that. But that's not what federal data says. Federal data says that adoptions have increased, reunifications have decreased. And of course, there's federal policy that provides financial incentives to states for adoptions, there is no such policy around any kind of incentives for safe reunifications. So federal policy has been tilted toward adoption ever since the passage of the Adoption and Safe Family Act. And so perhaps it's not a complete surprise that there would have been an increase in adoptions and not as much in reunifications. So I guess one of the things I want to say here, and then I'll pause here for just a minute, is there's a lot of knowledge about reunification. And probably in child welfare, maybe I don't know of any other subject where research and practice vary as enormously and as widely as on this particular area of practice, right? So there is definitely a lot of science there to guide, and there's a lot of consistency in findings about what it takes to achieve safe and stable reunifications. And by and large, states just haven't paid any attention, or they haven't paid an awful lot of attention. And I have and that is true in this state as well. So I have the impression that there has been a sort of not just a pendulum swing, but a sea change in attitudes around reunification in this state in recent years among both the judiciary, many advocates, many people who work in child welfare, around we ought to be doing more to reunify kids. But that hasn't necessarily translated into resources and into different practices. It's been mostly an ideological kind of a talk about how bad foster care is and how much kids need to be with their parents and so on and so forth. So there's been a strong social value bent there, which we can talk about here in a minute, but it hasn't been so much that the state has done a lot of new things. And there's a lot of things that the state could do and ought to be doing if we want to increase the percentage of kids with safe reunifications, right? So, so before I go any further here, let me stop and see if anyone has comments or questions. And again, you can either put this into chat or you can speak up. Before I go any further.
There's a lot of question here. There's not a substantive question, but there are a lot of numbers here that are really fascinating. Will these be made available somehow? And I'm sorry if I missed that earlier.
Yes, I will send you some, I'll send you various stuff that has numbers.
Appreciate it.
And if after receiving that stuff, you don't get your question answered, whatever it is, then you can send me just a query to my email. I'll be glad to provide it. I don't mind at all. I have lots of the information at the ready. And so, yeah, there is a lot of information here. And by the way, there's a huge amount of information on Chapin Hall. Chapin Hall, particularly the research entity in Chicago, has a whole huge administrative database on permanent planning subjects, kids in foster care around the country. Chapin Hall has a website. I mean, all that's public. You can also go to AFGAR's data. That's federal data and that's available online. You can go look at the latest AFGAR's reports. And so all of that has huge amounts of information in it. Now, one of the things to understand that just to start off about reunification is reunification rates vary greatly with age of child. And so one of the ways so you probably already know that maybe 20% of kids who go into foster care in this state and other states are 0 to 1. So this is the way that child welfare in the United States varies from child welfare in lots of places in Western Europe. That is, a lot more very little kids are going into care, and particularly a lot more very young kids, infants and toddlers. So at least twice as many infants and toddlers are going to care each year as 1-year-olds. So there is really in the sort of the child welfare world, there is, when you talk about rates of entry into care for infants got to be twice what they are for 1-year-olds. 1-year-olds, they're higher than for 2-year-olds. For 2-year-olds, they're higher than for 3-year-olds. So there is, in the child welfare world in the US, a strong association and relationship between the age of the child and entry rates into care, and also between the ratio of permanent planning outcomes for those various groups. So one time, maybe 10 years ago, when I was at the University of Washington, some people there and we looked at, and we did this for CASA in the state, we looked at, well, what was the effect of CASA programs on permanent planning outcomes in this state? Well, one of the things we found as a part of that study was not more than a third of infants were being reunified with parents at that time. So remember, and at that time, by the way, probably 60% of kids in Washington were being reunified instead of 50 nationally, but closer to 60% in this state, but only about a third of infants. So the younger the child, generally speaking, the more likely it is that there will be an adoption as opposed to reunification. And then at some point that starts to go the other way. And we also know that length of stay is related to permanent planning outcomes. So on average, reunification takes about half the time of adoption. So states, for example, that have higher reunification rates are going to, on average, have lower lengths of stay because reunification just doesn't take as long. And then you probably also know, but one thing to consider in terms of social policy is that anytime states or a national government like ours has a policy preference for legal structure, that means there are going to be longer lengths of stay. So once you put kids in foster care and you put legal structure around them, it's going to take time to get those kids out. And that has been a policy preference in the United States for now going on 30 years. And so the alternative, of course, would be to use more voluntary agreements. And that's what used to happen in child welfare when I worked there. When I worked in child welfare, we did a lot of placements on a voluntary basis, but the feds never liked those because a certain number of those kids would not be reunified. And then some of them would end up staying in foster care for a long time. And the feds thought that that was a very bad thing. And so they kind of developed policies over the years to make it harder to use voluntary agreements as opposed to legal structure. But now it's gone so extremely the other way. We have lots of kids in care for a long time, many times much longer than they need to be there, just because there's legal structure, and it's hard to satisfy courts that parents have met all the conditions for return of the kids there. Right? So before I go any further here, let me stop and see if you have a comment or question here, either in chat or in any other way. Okay, so couple of things that's helpful to know. So particularly in the reunification area, when you start talking about families with drug alcohol issues, mental health, and so forth, it's not necessarily that shorter is better. So there has been a robust series of, there are a lot of research that have made the same finding over a long period of time, which that in the reunification area, short lengths of stay are related to higher rates of reentry into care. So I want to say that again. Shorter lengths of stay are associated with higher rates of reentry into care for reasons that are probably quite commonsensy to all of you. Because when you have parents with chronically relapsing conditions, and until they're well established in treatment, of course, there is a high probability of relapse, and with all the associated effects on parenting. And so it is very possible, therefore, particularly for state systems that are very almost consumed with the idea of reducing the number of kids in care, reducing the length of stay in care, to return kids to parents before parents are ready to have those kids returned. And so what that means is that there will be a higher rate of reentry of those kids into care. And the very distressing piece of news that has come out in recent years is that the highest rates of reentry into care are for infants. And remember, infants have the lowest rate of reunification in the first place. And then they have this, in recent years, 36%, like more than a third of those infants who are reunified are returning to foster care systems. And that's in 11 or 12 states across the country. So that's not just in a single state there. So that is a finding that sort of has some practical meaning and significance here. So we're going to talk about, well, what would be some of the indicators that parents are ready and able to be effectively, successfully, safely reunified with their kids. And a lot of times haste and urgency about doing that is not the right approach. I mean, if we want the reunifications to be stable. I do want to say that there is one really super good book on reunification that came out about 15 years ago by Jill Barrick called Take Me Home. And so I want to recommend that book. There aren't many really super good books in child welfare for whatever reason, and particularly not books that combine kind of data, scholarly analysis with personal stories. But Barrick's book is one of them. And she has a chapter on reunification, which anyone who's interested in the subject should really read this chapter, because it's not only administrative data, she had direct intimate personal contact with 6 women in California who had lost their kids, and all of whom were drug involved. And then all 6 women got their kids back over a period of years. It took them a long time. And Barrick follows their struggles, and they were struggles, around what allowed them to succeed, what stood in their way. And so from a standpoint of a very intimate personal account of what helps in reunification and what stands in the way, I recommend the Barrick book. And it's a paperback. It also has chapters on adoption, on guardianship, on other subjects, but the chapter on reunification is outstanding. And so I want to call attention to that. Well, one of the things that Barrick found right off the bat is that the biggest problem for these women, well, first there were several problems, but let me just go through a list here. The women were poor, really, really poor. And they weren't getting a lot of help, if any help at all, from public agencies. And so some of them were on welfare, but some of them lost, as you know, even if women are on welfare, which, by the way, is a lot less likely today than it was 20 years ago. So even if women are on welfare, they may lose welfare. They may lose TANF benefits at the time that kids go into care. And it turns out that agencies in offices in this state have a lot of discretion, more discretion than in other states, and how that law is implemented and what happens there. Nevertheless, a lot of parents with kids in foster care are really, really poor. And that poverty stands in the way of reunification. So there's a strong body of science here that shows that parents' income during the time when kids are in foster care is directly related to the speed of reunification and to the stability of reunification. So I want to say both those things. Parental poverty is related both to the speed of reunification, the timeliness of it, as well as to the stability of it. And this is what Barrick found with the women that she had, these 6 women that, and these women had super serious drug problems and histories. But the thing that stood in the way mostly was they just were too poor. They just could not afford housing. And if they had housing, they couldn't afford furniture. They even when their kids were returned, they didn't have enough income a lot of times to be food secure. Well, of course, courts would be reluctant to return kids in those circumstances, no matter what the law says. And they were in California, and they have been historically in Washington State as well. So this is one of these areas, when you start talking about social values, start talking about why people have changed, there have been such a change in attitudes toward reunification in recent years. This is one of the reasons, because not just poverty, but the degree of poverty is so strongly associated with whether parents can ever get their kids back. And here, remember, you're talking about 60% of people who have incomes under $10,000 a year, according to the POC survey. And in Washington State, that same survey found that 1/5 of the parents with open child welfare cases had 0 income from either public benefits, from welfare, or from work. So if they had any income at all, they were living with someone. And they weren't, in that study, they weren't living with anyone who had an income of more than $20,000 a year. So that was 1/5 of all the parents in that survey. So poverty has a very direct, meaningful, concrete, huge effect on reunification, just as it does, by the way, on entry into care. And of course, it doesn't mean that it's a standalone thing. As I've already mentioned, it's poverty combined with substance abuse and with mental health conditions, and a lot of times with DV and cognitive impairments. It's the combination of poverty with psychological afflictions. That's what characterizes child welfare in this country. It's not just poverty, and it's not just substance abuse, mental health, DV, etc. It's that combination. And it's that combination which has such a tremendous effect on the capacity of people to function at all, much less to be adequate parents. That's what makes reunification so incredibly difficult here. So one thing from a public policy point of view, and this is one of the things that Barrick said in this book right off the bat, those California agencies that those women were dealing with, they were missing in action. Those caseworkers a lot of times didn't have contact with those women once every 3 months, if that much. So they weren't getting emotional support or concrete support from the public agencies at all in California. I don't know how that is today in this state, but of course, that's where we want to start. If we want to have more effective reunifications, then the level of support to parents with kids in foster care has got to increase. And I mean concretely from the standpoint of income, but I also mean emotional support. So there is a strong body of research here in recent years. Barrick has done some of it, that has found that any kind of program that provides emotional support, such as parent mentors, such as therapy in Connecticut, therapists who are hired or contracted with by the public agency to support reunification, drug coaches, whatever they're called in Illinois, substance abuse, chemical dependency experts who then support parents who have drug and alcohol problems. If you want to increase reunification, people have to have help like that. Otherwise, reunification is a struggle. It's someone on their own who is poor, who is very, very troubled, and who may or may not have good kinship support. And so obviously, let me just say about the kinship care thing. One of the reasons that Barrick's book was viewed as courageous and was viewed as kind of, a lot of people in child welfare didn't like it so much, was that she found that a lot of times the relatives were more hurtful than helpful. Many of the relatives had drug and alcohol issues. Many of the relatives that the kids were placed with had drug and alcohol issues. Sometimes the relatives placed the kids back with the parents without telling the public agency. Sometimes that went on for months. So a lot of times the kinship care families were not that helpful. In fact, some of them were about as neglectful of the kids as the parents had been before they were removed. Some were helpful. So it's going to make a tremendous difference in child welfare whether parents have good kinship support. And so one of the reasons, Hispanic families are poor, almost as poor, not quite as, but almost as poor as Black families. But they have much lower rates of child welfare involvement. They have rates that are much closer to white families. And of course, the lowest rates of child welfare involvement of any racial ethnic group in the US is Asian families. It's not white families, it's Asian families, right? So why is that? Because once you have better family support, you don't need to have child welfare help, or not as much of it. So Hispanics have much lower rates of foster care, much higher rates of reunification, much lower rates of adoption, because they have stronger, more coherent, cohesive family cultures. And that starts with living arrangements. So if you have people who live in the proximity within a community, within a neighborhood, they're there to support one another, right? As opposed to people being fairly isolated. And, you end up in child welfare with lots of people who have alienated their entire families because of drug addiction. Any of you who has my guess is several of you probably have people who have drug and alcohol problems, issues within your family, as I do. You will understand then that sometimes the people with drug abuse issues, they have alienated their whole entire family. They've alienated all of their friends. They are very, very much on their own. And sometimes it's a long way back to achieve any kind of forgiveness within family groups about the horrible things that happened when people were addicts, or when they were engaged in domestic violence on a regular basis, or when they were mentally ill. It's a long way back to restore a lot of those families. But that is one of those avenues for how we make reunification more effective. That is, we try to reestablish and renew the strength of family ties that have been frayed, that have been broken, they have been hurt by the very problems that led kids to be placed into foster care, and that have had a huge impact on extended families, right? So what do we know? Let me go back just real quickly about the things, and it's a short list, as the ad says, it in atomic physics. If you want to have more successful, more safer reunifications, you got to have someone who's providing emotional support to that parent on a weekly basis. Someone has to do that. It doesn't have to be the caseworker. It doesn't necessarily have to be you. It can be a minister. It can be a friend. It can be a substance abuse counselor, but it's got to be somebody. So if you're leaving people to function kind of on their own in an isolated way, you wouldn't be surprised that they would fail. And that's what child welfare systems have largely done for decades up until maybe the last 15 to 20 years, where that started to be pointed out to people around the country. Income matters. It matters a lot. And income is partly a result of public policy for low-income people. So this is a country now where, I don't know, the last thing I saw in Washington, maybe a quarter of people who were eligible for TANF were actually getting it. You know, it used to be 75, 80, 90%. You know, public agencies have done everything in the world in recent years to deny public benefits to people who are eligible for them. So that has been public policy. That's not by accident. That's been public policy. And of course, it used to be that if kids went into foster care, they lost their benefits. Now, this state, to its credit, changed those laws mainly because of Ruth Kagi and a couple of other people in the legislature in past years to allow parents to continue to receive the benefits that they were receiving before when it and to receive TANF benefits several months before kids are anticipated to be returned home. So that is going to matter. That level of income is going to matter. So one of the most valuable programs that this state has made a big investment in the PCAP program, Parent-Child Assistance. Well, you probably know that's home visitation for children from the prenatal period till they're age 3, and that's paraprofessional home visiting. That's the example of a kind of emotional support, concrete support that people need in order to succeed at reunification. So if a state wants to safely increase reunification, there has to be an investment in those kind of programs. In programs, it doesn't have to be PCAP, but it has to be something like PCAP. There has to be concrete support. There has to be emotional support. Where there have been increased and successful reunification efforts in this state, and there is research on this subject, it has been through these family treatment drug courts and through the safe baby courts that now exist in maybe half a dozen communities in Washington, right? So some kind of teaming. So you want parents to be a part of an ongoing team that is going to support them. And what that means is that you meet weekly or you meet bi-weekly, and parents receive immediate feedback on how they're doing in the reunification. And so if they're doing poorly, they get called on it immediately. If they're doing well, they get praised. If you want people in any area of work, any area, no matter what it is, child welfare, any other area, you want people to do hard, challenging, tough things. Hard, challenging, tough things. You have to give them lots of reward and praise for making little steps in the right direction. That's what you have to do. If you want people to fail, you ignore what they're doing. You ignore what they're doing when it's positive, and then when they screw up, you stomp on them. That's what you do if you want people to fail. So that area. So parents need mentors. They need money, either through public benefits or they sometimes that means that they need to be employed if at all possible. They need a team around them. They need extended family support. And when kids go home, they are going to need resources for practical things like food, clothing, furniture, transportation. Lots of the families we're dealing with here are single parent women, low income, poor women with maybe more than one child here, right? They're going to need child care, regular child care they need respite care. They need money for various, and a lot of those families are going to be food insecure. So there has been just a shocking study to me that has come out within the last several months. That's not just a child welfare study, but it's sort of a study of poverty in the United States, which, as you know, during the pandemic went down because of all the federal relief that was given to poor families. This study found that 23% of Black families and Native American families currently within the last year were food insecure. I just want you to reflect on that a bit. That means almost 1 in 4 Black families and Native American families did not have enough to eat on a daily basis. That's child welfare in America. And somehow that kind of stuff isn't viewed as, quote, a safety threat. It somehow doesn't rise to the level that we're going to intervene and do anything about that. So you want to know what's wrong with child welfare in America? It's that kind of set of social values. It's that we're going to pay a lot of attention to drug alcohol issues, a lot, as we should. We're going to pay a lot of attention to mental health issues, a lot of attention to DV, a lot of attention to all these other kind of impairments that parents have, and they really do have them. That's not fiction. They really do have them. But somehow we're not going to pay too much attention to the poverty issues. We're going to assume that people should just be able to manage whatever their income is. And, and this book, maybe, about 5 years ago, this book came out called Living on $2 a Day in America. Well, it turned out that 4% of American children were living in families where the average income was $2 a day per person. $2 a day per person, 4% of American children. So 5 to 10% of American children are living in families who are severely poor. That means their income is less than 50% of the federal poverty standard. That means concretely incomes of less than $12,000 a year. So yeah, so we do know some of the things that it's going to take for reunification to be more effective here. And that's why I have become in this area, because there have been a lot of failed reunifications. There have been child deaths out of reunification, as all of you know. So you do reunification the wrong way, and I'm going to tell you in a minute here what the wrong way is, at least in my opinion. Then yeah, you can put kids' lives at risk, not just their well-being, their lives. So it is important that we do reunification the right way. But I become a proponent because I know from the research that there are concrete things many of these are very affordable things that we could really do if we wanted people to succeed at reunification more frequently than is currently the case. So let me stop there and give you a chance to, got 20 minutes left, so maybe we can sort of turn our discussion a little bit here to policy issues to some extent, but let me stop and see if you have a comment or question here. You can either put it in chat or you can speak up.
Perhaps this, sorry, I mean, I might be a little bit kind of like thinking about it too complicated in a way, but isn't it the trend of like with substance abuse, the thinking of total abstinence versus now the trend is kind of possibly moving towards a little bit more about so-called reduction of harm. Is that trend also sort of part of like a value judgment to affect, reunification or affect, would you, I mean, I'm not sure if I'm thinking.
No, I understand the question, and that issue, that subject has been discussed it isn't just recently, it's been the last 25 to 30 years. That's been an ongoing discussion. And let me just say that it's a little bit of a complicated subject, because what happens actually, or what has happened a lot of times in this state, has been that the treatment agencies, by and large, have really gone for abstinence, 100%, getting off of drugs and alcohol. But once people have gone through the programs, it mainly has been really a harm reduction kind of thing. So it's been sort of there's been a contradiction or a conflict between thinking about goals, what goals ought to be, and the actual ongoing implementation of programs, which has been more along the lines of harm reduction. And so there has been a lot of research done in this state about the value, the sort of the cost benefit analysis of substance abuse intervention. And a lot of that has been done by DSHS and by their Office of Research and Data Analysis. And that is almost 100%, that's harm reduction research. So that research doesn't, for example, track abstinence rates, which tend to be pretty low for people recovering from addictions. It tracks things like emergency room visits. It tracks things like percentage of people employed. It tracks things like getting your kids back out of foster care. So a lot of the analysis of benefits of substance abuse intervention has been from a harm reduction kind of a point of view. And there has always been that tension in child welfare. There have always been people who had different views on this subject. But when it came down to push comes to shove in the implementation of programs, it really has been sort of in treatment, it's been absences of the goal. And it used to be, for example, sometimes that relapse would be viewed as grounds for removing kids or not sending them home or something. But my experience has been that once kids are home, then for the most part, it's harm reduction kind of stuff. I mean, we're looking if people relapse, then we're looking at, well, what's the effect of relapse on parenting behavior? We're just not looking at relapse in and of itself there, right? So let me just say, just real briefly about the kind of reunification practice that endangers kids' life. So again, there has been a lot of research on this particular subject, and not so much in this state, but in other states. So what most of that research has found is that for the most part, decision makers, and here I mean both caseworkers, I mean sometimes guardian ad litems, CASAs like yourself, and judges and commissioners, a lot of times are making reunification decisions based on whether parents have complied with mandated court orders. And that has been because that's pretty straightforward about the ability to evaluate that, right? You know, so that seems to be a more of a factual kind of determination. I mean, people really have either completed the programs or they haven't. They've done what the court ordered them or they haven't done it, kind of thing, right? And so a lot of times the public defenders have really, the attorneys have really liked that kind of way of doing things because it seems more like fair to them, as opposed to depending on subjective judgments. The problem with it is it's a horrible way to make decisions about kids' lives, because it just turns out that compliance is not really with either strict compliance with court mandates or non-compliance is not necessarily associated with those changes that need to happen for kids to be safe. And so there has been a very rough relationship at best. And so what do I mean by that? So particularly in the drug alcohol area, before kids go home, it's not just that you want parents to change their patterns of use. Of course, that is important. You do want them to change their patterns of use, either giving up use of drugs and alcohol or using them a lot less. But mostly, you want them to change their motivation. And the motivational scheme is something like this. What comes first in their lives? Is it the safety of their kids, or is it the obtaining drug and alcohol? And so that is a straightforward kind of question. A lot of times, decision makers haven't wanted to answer it because it seems like making judgments around motivation is kind of subjective, or we wouldn't exactly know what the right indicators were for that. But in my view, it's in the drug and alcohol area, it's the all important thing from the standpoint of child safety. There has either been this switch in parental values or there hasn't been. And if there hasn't been, kids are not going to be safe. And that is, they're not going to be safe even if the parents are totally clean and sober. Because of course, total clean and sober sometimes means a lot more depressed. So generally speaking, you know, it's good that parents use drugs less, but it doesn't necessarily mean that because they do, kids are always going to be safe, right? So you really want to be able to evaluate the effect of changes in behavior on parental motivation. And so it's a good thing to start thinking about. We don't have time here now, but this is a good training kind of session to have among CASAs or in other kind of ways with caseworkers as well. What would be the indicators of motivation? How do you in your life, in your family, with your friends, with your kids, with your spouse, with people you know, how do you evaluate motivation? Because the truth is, as social beings, we are really good at it. That's why we're kind of fascinated with con men, con people who are able to put it over on the rest of us. But for the most part, most of us, we're really pretty astute at this. So there are several behavioral indicators of motivation, and we need to be applying those in the child welfare arena. And so things like, our parents, when concrete events occur that sort of puts a parent's interest up against the child's interest, how does the parent choose? For years, there has been a finding in child welfare that the main indicator of successful reunification is the visitation record. It's not whether people get clean and sober, is the visitation record. Well, why? From my standpoint, it's a sort of a proxy. The visitation record is a proxy for motivation. How committed is a parent to getting their kids back? You know, those parents that Barrick talked to in California that she talks about in her book, those parents all had serious drug problems. But you know, the reason they succeeded and other people didn't succeed, for some miraculous reason, they decided somewhere along the line that they wanted their kids back more than anything. They wanted their kids back as much as life itself. So they were willing to do anything at all that it was going to take, including giving up the use of drugs in order to get those kids back. And how did that happen? Because Barrick doesn't have an explanation for it. It's just that for these women, that's what happened. And that's why they succeeded more than other people who may have done as well or better in the programs. And so another way, from because as anyone in the substance abuse area is going to tell you, relapse is a sort of a standard feature of recovery. So what happens in a drug in a recovery kind of a format when relapse occurs? Relapse can take people right out of a treatment program. It's not a minor thing, no matter what anybody says or has told you in training. It's not a minor thing. But on the other hand, it can actually, in many cases, result in a greater commitment to recovery. So that's one of the ways that we sort of evaluate the motivation of people in substance abuse treatment is what happens when they relapse. Same kind of thing now, like my wife and I are both on diets. Many of you probably on diets all the time. There's not a person in the world that I've ever known who's ever been on a diet who hasn't relapsed, and usually a lot. The thing about it is, the thing about dieting and relapse is what happens after you have a cinnamon roll? What happens after Thanksgiving dinner? What happens after you blow it? That's the measure of motivation. Do you get right back on the horse? Do you get right back into the diet or the program or the treatment program? Or do you just say, well, hey, screw it. I already blew it. If I already had a couple beers, I might as well just drink a case. So that is an indicator of motivation. The persistence in the face of obstacles. All of us understand that is an indicator of motivation. So that is one of the key indicators of whether people are going to be successful, the extent to which their motivational frameworks have changed or not. Now, issues around the amount of contact that parents have had with kids. I call this experience, but the amount of contact, regular and contact that has enjoyment in it. So if you want to look for signs, for example, in visits and in the kind of interaction that parents have with kids, it's particularly during visits, is there enjoyment? Is there stuff that's going on there is there a reciprocal exchange, at least to some extent, between parents and kids that is enjoyable? The more that is true, the more likely it is that reunification is going to work. If all the interactions between parents and little kids is painful, if it's painful to watch it for 1 hour, how is that going to work when parents are living with kids on a full-time basis? When they can't manage their behavior, when their crankiness, their crying gets them down, there's much more likely that there's going to be a lot of punitive, harsh punishment at the very least, right? If there's no enjoyment kind of thing there. Issues around efficacy. What's happened with most of the parents that we deal with in child welfare is that little by little, they've lost the ability to do things for themselves. I mean, the kind of things, just normal stuff. Get out of bed in the morning, get showered, get dressed, get your kids breakfast. If you have a job, actually get to work on time. Do the kind of things that clean your house. Do the kind of things that it just takes to live. People have gradually, those kind of, that kind of capacity, which in social work is called efficacy. That is the kind of thing that's vanished there for lots of the families. And of course, the tendency is to judge people moralistically when they can't do these things, but that's kind of a misunderstanding of what's going on there. One of the effects of depression, one of the effects of addiction is little by little, it takes away people's ability to do things for themselves. And so that is probably the best measure of whether recovery has really happened. Has efficacy been restored in this person's life? If they need help, can they get out of bed, get out of the apartment, get on a bus, go to a food bank, go to a doctor, go ask for help, do whatever it takes in a pro-social way. And the very weird thing about lots of drug addicts is they seem helpless in most areas of their life, but when it comes to obtaining drugs, wow, boy, they are efficacious in the goddamn extreme. They are phenomenally skillful and motivated. That's what it means to be efficacious. And then, of course, issues around resources, and I've already talked about that at length. That really does matter in reunification. Whether once kids go home, particularly very little kids, they need to be in childcare as many hours a week as the parents will allow them to be. We don't want to send any baby and any toddler home without a childcare plan, not ever. So that is, and some communities have lots of resources of that type and some don't. So there's an element of reunification planning that really does depend on the level of resources in the community. So it's one thing to live in Seattle, another thing to live in Olympia, lots of resources, one thing to live in Vancouver, in Spokane. How about if you're out on the peninsula? What if you're out there in Raymond, Aberdeen, Hoquiam, that area where I was a regional administrator for a long time, where there's no resources, right? And then, of course, you want people to have increased skills around parenting. And that tends to be, by the way, the last thing that people acquire in a kind of recovery program, not the first thing, even though there's some mixed research on this particular subject. So I call these criteria for reunification, safe reunification, I call it MEERS, MEERS. And I have PowerPoint that I send you guys, and that sort of sets forth what that acronym means. M stands for motivation, E stands for enjoyment, E stands for efficacy. I also put an extra E in there, stands for experience, the amount that which there's been ongoing continued visits. R stands for resources, S stands for skills. So the MEERS criteria are ways of evaluating the likelihood that reunification is going to be safe. And so I am strongly opposed to the idea that we're going to create reunification in this state, mostly through ideological beating up on people. That is incredibly dangerous. A lot of that is actually going on to some extent. What I've heard is that even some courts are engaging in it to some extent or other. That's not the way to succeed here. There is a way to go, and it's to focus on improving the resources and improving our ability to assess, according to these indicators that I've mentioned, whether reunification is going to be successful or not. So let me stop. Christina says family therapeutic courts, at least 18 of them. That's probably that, and the safe baby courts. Those are probably the best things that have happened in reunification in this practice over the last 15 to 20 years. It's those things, and those are research-based things. Other kind of comments or questions here? So.
I guess I do have a question. You talk about data and research, and is there a lot of data and research that supports the benefits of reunification? Because it's hard to find sometimes what you can tell a court as to why the outcomes are so much better for kids if you pursue reunification.
I think the data on behavioral outcomes of reunification, I think it's quite mixed there. So I wouldn't want to, I don't think, for example, I wouldn't go into court and say, we know that kids who go back to parents are going to be better off than if they don't go back to parents. And, I think that this is an area where there's lots of uncertainties, say the least. And so it kind of depends on, well, going back to what kind of a home situation. So there needs to be, it's wrong to be thinking of reunification as a homogeneous, it's all one kind of thing. So let me give an example. There are a whole bunch of babies who go into foster care before they ever have any kind of relationship with parents. They may go into care in the first month, the first day of life, or very, very quickly. And so the attachments they form are really with foster parents or with relatives, right? So that's a completely different kind of a situation than a kid who already has a very strong relationship and attachment, and a positive one, with their parent. And so for those kids, the strongest argument is for kids who already have a strong, positive, nurturing attachment with parents. Those are the kids naturally who are going to benefit the most from reunification. I think a lot of the argument in child welfare has less to do with what are the behavioral outcomes over a long run. It's more like, well, what about safety issues? And again, here, I think I mentioned before, but there is a lot of information, and I sent Ryan some the other day here, about what are reentry into care rates, sort of what's the rate of placement breakdown in reunification. And so the rate across 11 states, in about a 5-year period, was about 27%, a little more than a quarter of reunifications failed, but 36% of reunifications for infants failed. So that's really a shocking thing. So if, for example, if I was an opponent of reunification, I say, look at the 36% failure rate. That's a challenge to people who really believe that we should be trying hard to reunify infants with parents. I am one of those people. Why do I believe that? Because there are kind of resources that we can use to increase the likelihood that reunification is going to work in those situations, right? Okay, where it is most difficult to figure out what's in the best interest of kids a lot of times is when you get into the school age range, right? So what if kids have behavior problems, serious ones, and they're evident in foster care, they're evident if they stay with relatives, they're evident if they go back to parents. And so a lot of times the question for those kids has to do with, are the parents really going to be able to manage these? It's not just, are the kids going to be safe? Are the kids going to be able to manage, or the parents going to be able to manage these kids' behavioral challenges, which are very, very severe? And that is, by the way, the same way that we would look at the foster care system, because foster care systems have done, by and large, a miserable job of caring for behaviorally difficult school-aged kids. So it's not like there's some body of research that says that foster care has done great for behaviorally troubled kids, but birth parents have done bad, or vice versa. It isn't like that. All the parties engaged in child welfare have done bad, and that includes foster care systems when you talk about the behaviorally troubled kids. So I think when you start talking about, well, what are the behavioral outcomes? One of the things that is found, and this is, I've written much on the foster care systems in this state in recent years, and so it's very helpful to think of foster care as a dissected system. That is, there was one set of outcomes for kids who were school age, and there's one set of outcomes for kids who are younger than school age. And when you start talking about, the emotional effects of reunification, then to do that in an intelligent, thoughtful way, you really have to know something about, well, what was the quality of the child's relationship before they entered foster care? And what's the quality, not just the issues around safety, not just that. What's the quality of nurturance there between parents and kids? And so I think that is an area where I would be very careful about making any sweeping kind of a generalization around whole groups of people, around whether kids are going to be better off or not be better off. And I would focus on a specific child or a specific group of kids, right? And maybe that's not the answer that everyone wants, but it's the best answer that I kind of got here, right? So, and so let me say, just since we're 12 o'clock, I just want to say one more thing here around social justice kind of issues here, right? So, I've already said this, but I'm going to say this one more time, right? So why has there been such a sea change in thinking within the last several years on reunification and child welfare, as on lots of other subjects? Because people have been, a whole lot of people, advocates and scholars and judicial officers have just become aware that in lots of cases, child welfare has kind of been a way that official agencies have taken kids away from low-income families, troubled low-income families, and put them in hopefully better functioning middle-class or upper-middle-class families, and then not done that much to help them get their kids back, and then had high rates of adoption into these families, so that child welfare has been kind of a way of severing the relationships between parents and kids, moving kids from very disadvantaged people to very advantaged people, and having child welfare sort of be in the center as the conduit for that, for all of that, right? So that is very much of a social justice kind of a concern there. And I can understand that people have it. At the same time, I don't know how it can be a social justice value to put kids in situations where their lives are in danger. How can that be social justice? So we really do want to think about the issue of safe, what is it going to take to produce safe and stable reunifications? And I've already said that there are several things that we can do to make that more likely. So lots of things. I do want to say one more thing about this research in this area here, because I've written a lot about this, I've read a lot about this, and I hear a lot of loose talk, a lot of generalizations that just are not true, and that are just coin of the realm in child welfare today and discussions of foster care reform. Like I frequently hear the thought that all kids who are placed out of the home suffer trauma. Well, that's not true. That's true sometimes. For some kids, that's very severe, but some kids don't even have a relationship with a birth parent for various reasons. Sometimes having to do with age, sometimes having to do with a parent's illness, or just that they've been horribly treated by that parent. So lots of things that are said that are true of some kids are being said that are like they're true of all kids, but they're not true of all kids. And so that's why there has to be a lot more of a discerning kind of look here at the situations that kids were in before they entered care around what's going to happen when they return home, right? And when they return home, particularly in the school age years, to say this one more time, it's not just an issue around safety. It's an issue around helping parents to manage the behavioral problems of their kids, which are probably going to be a lot of times pretty serious because they spent their early years experiencing some level of maltreatment, as well as whatever happened to them in foster care. So, let me see. There's other things that I can respond to. And by the way, I've got a lot of information on foster care outcomes. I'd be glad to share it with whoever. Let me see. Okay, let me stop here. We're at 5 minutes after. I'm not in any hurry to get off, but some of you may be. But yeah, let me see. Open it up here and see if anyone else has thoughts or questions. Okay, maybe one more thing I'll say, and then I'll stop here on the research side of things around, because there's been a lot of support, in my view, merited around the attempts to increase the use of kinship care in the last 20 years or so. And so there's a body of research here that's pretty solid. And so what we know from that research is that kinship care on average is more stable than non-relative care on average. Even when you hold behavioral problems of kids in entry into care pretty constant, even when you control for that, kinship care is still going to be on average more stable than non-kin care. And so that's on average. That doesn't mean in every instance. At the same time, kinship care providers have no more ability to deal with a lot of times the behavior troubles of problems, challenges of kids than the non-kin caregivers do. So kinship care isn't the answer to all of our foster care problems in this state or any other state, because where foster care systems are struggling is with this behaviorally troubled group of youth, many of whom are in this 6 to 17, 18-year-old age range. And kinship care providers no more able to deal with that group of people, sometimes less able than non-kin care providers. So there are some very good things about kinship care, but there are also some limits to it, right? And then also the kinship care providers on average are going to be poorer. A lot of times, obviously, are going to be older because there's lots of grandparents involved. And that means that a lot of the kinship care providers are going to have health problems. So I've seen it happen many, many times during my career in child welfare, that little kids would be placed with relatives when they were in the preschool years. And then by the teenage years, they have to be placed somewhere else because a relative has died. You know, they were placed with someone who's maybe in their 60s or 70s at a time when they were 3 or 4. And by the time they're 14, someone in that family has died, or they're in very, very poor health. And so you end up with a reentry rate out of guardianships. A lot of the kids in kinship care end up in guardianships, as you know, and the breakdown in guardianships is around 1 in 5. You know, so remember, the breakdown in reunification is about 1 in 4, 1 in 5 in reunification kind of thing. What is the resource you would suggest for the body of research on kinship care? I will send you some stuff. There just is so much in this area that you're really not going to have any trouble in finding it. But I have some stuff, and I can be very, very willing to share it here, you know, around that. So, Let me see, is there anything else that I can respond to that I haven't responded to? Okay, well, maybe I'll stop there. Yeah, and if you guys have an interest in more discussion, this is a big subject. We just scratched the surface of it. I mean, you guys have, an interest in talking about this more and around social policy issues, I'd be very glad to do that, or talk about foster care. There's a whole complex literature here on foster care outcomes, as I mentioned. Be very glad to discuss that, or issues of infant well-being and care. That's an interest of mine, and there's a lot that's been written on that subject. So I'm very, very glad to discuss that. So.
Great. Thank you.